welcome to the Rob Burgess Show. I'm, of course, your host, Rob Burgess. On this, our 78th episode, our returning guest is Jared Yates Sexton. You first heard Jared Yates Sexton on episode 65 of the podcast. Jared Yates Sexton is a writer, academic, and author who has published 4 books of fiction and has had his work appear in the New York Times, The New Republic, Salon, Paste, and elsewhere. His book, The People Are Going to Rise Like the Waters Upon Your Shore, A Story of American Rage, was published by Counterpoint. It's out now and you should definitely read it. Currently, he serves as an assistant professor of creative writing at Georgia Southern University. And now, on to the show.
Hello?
Rob?
Yeah, hey, Jared.
Hey, I am so sorry about the delay, man.
No, it's okay. I was a couple minutes late myself, so this negates my lateness, so it's all good.
That's my favorite type of late right there.
That's right. So yeah, thanks for coming back on the podcast, man. I really appreciate it.
No problem, man. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, so you're on book tour right now, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in between stops right now. So I just got back from New Orleans, and I'm leaving tomorrow morning for Providence, Rhode Island.
Oh, wow. Okay, so you're all over everywhere.
I woke up this morning in like a white-hot panic, and I was like, I don't know where I need to be, and I don't like it.
Exactly. Well, that's awesome, though. I mean, this has to feel like a little bit of a victory lap after putting so much work into the book and then having it come out. And it seems like it's doing well. You said it's on its 3rd printing on Twitter, I saw. So, yeah, it looks like it's going well.
Yeah, it's weird, though, because it's like, in between events and meeting people and stuff, it's like, that feels nice. But then, like, when I'm walking through, like, a corridor, inevitably Trump will be on a television, or a monitor, and I'm just like, oh, yeah, that's right. This is still happening.
Yeah, right, exactly. So I've read the whole book, and I have a whole bunch of questions for you, but before we get into that, I think I have to congratulate you on your torrid affair with Natalia Vidalneskaya. What the heck was going on with that story?
I will say that what I really appreciate there is for someone who had a torrid affair with her, I'm still struggling to pronounce her name, so I thought that was a really pretty amazing pronunciation. Yeah, man, that was like one of the weirder things to happen, I guess, in my quote-unquote public life, to look up and suddenly get connected to that, and then to finally see, like, up close how this, like, rumor machine / propaganda thing works. Like, it was pretty incredible.
Yeah, and I guess I should say the source of me saying that, I looked it up, I Googled it last night, is a website called whatdoesitmean.com, which if I'm remembering correctly, said it had the most articles every day on the internet, which was news to me because I never ever heard of this site before. So.
Well done. What a mark. What a way to get there.
Exactly. And then this kind of happened in the aftermath of the Don Jr. Email disclosures, and you also kind of simultaneously became something of a meme when you expressed frustration that you were working on that story for over a year, and then he just tweeted it out. Right. I did appreciate that you had a fair amount of good humor about it, because I did notice at one point your pinned tweet was they just printed my book out or whatever, so I appreciate you had a little bit of a sense of humor about it. So.
Well, you kind of have to be completely honest. It's like the internet and like the modern political world are so weird that at some point or another you just have to like sit back and marvel at the strangeness of it. I mean, the past 2 years of my life have been so surreal that like it's a source of like great joy, but it's also like a source of like total fear and just revulsion in a certain way. Like there's a lot of stuff going on, and the more that things like that happen, the more I'm just sort of like surprised and confused by it.
Right, exactly. Because I'll see tweets that have nothing to do with anything, and people will just be quoting that, and I'm like, oh my gosh, I know the sort, I know what they're talking about. That's crazy. I guess also kind of timing wise, interestingly, with your book coming out, also another retrospective of the 2016 campaign, obviously from somebody a little bit more high profile, would be the Hillary Clinton What Happened book. Have you dove into that at all? Have you read any of it?
I've read excerpts from it. I'm actually saving it. I have a couple of long drives coming up on the tour, so I'm planning on listening to it.
Okay.
But I'll tell you what I am sort of like really not surprised by, but kind of relieved to see is it's kind of good to see her unboxed, to see her sort of like have an opportunity to like speak openly without worrying about consequences or political posturing. And what I've seen so far, especially from her interviews and the excerpts, I think it's pretty remarkable seeing like who she is.
Yeah, I mean, I read 30 pages of it or so in a Barnes and Noble, and it, I intend to read the rest, but it was a pretty easy read, and I've heard the audiobook's the way to go as far as her reading it, so I'm looking forward to hearing that. But yeah, it is interesting to hear her perspective. Now, do you think timing-wise it's helpful though, because it seems like the biggest target that Trump would love to talk about is Hillary Clinton in the 2016 election. It's like catnip to him, so of course it's her right to do this. I would never say that she shouldn't. But do you think the timing of it coming out now, while everything's so fresh, is helpful?
Well, I think on two hands, there's a couple things happening here. Like in terms of like production wise, like a book being released, this was as quickly as it could have come out, which is sort of what happened with my book too. Right. It was like in terms of like a national release, like this thing would have had to have been released in August or September, and that was pushing it. So that's totally natural and sort of expected. As far as the political timing, I mean, she is still a public figure. She's still a politician, and I think if somebody who won the popular vote, I think she has a reason to be able to speak out and react to this stuff, and especially I think it's important that she reminds us not just how the election went down, but also like, there's the excerpts I've read where, she talks about how she felt like Trump was trying to like intimidate her and get in her space, and the way he was trying to sort of manipulate this very misogynistic campaign against her. I think it's important to remind people, especially as he's making deals with Democrats, that this is who that guy is.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, I know last time we talked, we spoke a little bit about the differences between writing nonfiction and fiction, and I went back and listened to the interview a little bit, and I remember you called yourself a pundit, and I did get through the entire book, and I realized nowhere in there do you call yourself a journalist, full stop. I think that's an interesting thing, because reading the book, I'm a journalist. I don't see you doing anything in the book that I wouldn't do. I mean, you do get in people's faces and drink a fair amount, but who hasn't lately? I mean, I have a beer next to me right now, so what am I? I'm not I'm not in any position to judge anybody in 2017 for that, but you know what I'm saying? I don't see you doing anything that's apart from what I would say a journalist does. And then a quote near the end, actually, I thought was a little bit illuminating. You said, "I'd crossed over into the media and started looking at politics as a game of chess instead of a process by which real people were affected in real and lasting ways." Does that have some weight on your decision to skirt that term, or what's your thinking there?
Well, I consider myself a journalist and a pundit at different times. I mean, it's weird because we have this weird media environment where things are switching and these old norms are kind of gone. And I actually just read a book by Franklin Foer, World Without Mind, and he got into a little bit about how journalism's roots were very partisan and were very sort of like political, and how that changed later on when it came to ad buying. I think we're getting back to the point where journalism sort of doesn't have a choice but to be partisan. I really don't think that you can cover this presidency and be completely objective, because one of the reasons that journalism exists, I think, is you are supposed to not only, talk truth to power, but you're also supposed to sort of sound the alarm when things aren't working the way they're supposed to work. So I feel like if I go to rallies, if I go to events, if I'm reporting reporting on what's happening, I think I'm a journalist. When I'm researching white supremacy collections or trends in America, then I'm a journalist. And then I also think I've got this other side of what I do, where I guess you would call me a pundit or a correspondent, or however you would get into that. I think I do both things. And there was actually a moment later on in the campaign, and I think that's what I was getting into in the book, is there was a moment later in the campaign where I realized what the difference is between those things, and how pundits are one of the problems in this country, because they're watching this as if it's a sporting event, right? And they're watching everything happen like without that human element. And I had a moment where I was in the middle of it and was having to sort of deal with that myself, and had to come back to terms with exactly why I did this. So I think for me that the difference between journalism and punditry is something I'm still like fighting and trying to figure out, especially because I think it's one of the more important things going on in our country.
Right. Well, I think that to be, I think the one thing that I do agree with is that I think to be that detached objectivity, God voice, not having any emotion, being an android, and just saying the facts and not giving any personal opinion. I feel like that's kind of got to go by the wayside in these days, because I feel like to be totally bloodless about it is to do a disservice to people that would read you, because everything is so visceral right now. It doesn't feel like there's any way to disconnect what's happening from how it, you know what I mean, how norm breaking and everything this is. We can't pretend this is normal. I just don't think we have that luxury.
Yeah, how can you be a citizen in the middle of this and not weigh in? Because there's going to be a moment, and it all depends on how things happen, but there's going to be a moment 20, 30, 40 years from now where we look back on this, and there's going to be an accounting of who acted and who didn't.
Right.
And to sit here and just, give the facts of a situation, like this is what somebody did, here's where they went.
Right.
We're no longer living in a fact-based society. We're living in spin come to life. So I really don't understand how you could be completely objective in this time period. It doesn't seem responsible now.
Right, exactly. One of the things I think you do really well in your writing is you really put a lot of effort into empathizing with people, and you do this with people that I personally haven't even tried to empathize with, which I'm thinking of Dylan Roof here. Do you find it difficult to put yourself in the shoes of someone like that? Because I see the pictures of him with the flag of Rhodesia and the burning American flag and all this craziness, and I don't feel any human connection to somebody like that. But he is a human being, an American. He came from the same country I did, so how different could he possibly be? And what do you think of empathizing with people like that? And does it change you in some way by putting yourself on that level? Because it's not even a headspace I'm prepared to go into in a lot of ways.
One of the first times I ever had a moment like that. Have you ever read the Unabomber Manifesto?
I don't think I've read all of it, but I've read enough of it to know the gist of it. Yeah.
So if you ever have a free afternoon, that's an interesting way to spend it. I'll just put it that way. So you have this person who had all these senseless attacks and murders and all this. And I read it a few years ago, and I was like, wow, philosophically, he's got points, right? He has, there's an underlying intelligence to this where he is making points. How he goes about punctuating that and attacking is the problem. It's not the philosophy, it's how the philosophy is put into action. Dylan Roof was different. His philosophy was obviously jaded and perverted and problematic. But then I started reading it, and I realized, as I said in the book, I realized when I started reading Dylan Roof's thing that when I first heard of him, and I saw the picture of him, and of course I was watching the reports of what he had done, and I looked at him, and I had that moment where I thought, wow, this is an idiot kid, and he's obviously just, I guess you would say, ignorant and dumb, and sort of like this kid from a poor background who doesn't know anything. And then I started reading his writings as they started coming about, and I realized there was an intelligence behind them. And it wasn't an intelligence that was being directed in the right way. It was an intelligence that had been misled and perverted, and actually through cognitive dissonance had been given an escape route to an easier explanation that led to him killing people. So I did. I had a long moment trying to figure him out and trying to understand what that intelligence was doing and where it was going. And actually, I think Dylan Roof is very emblematic of something else that's going on in this country. This is something that I'm doing some research on for the next book, and that is this group of young white male people who are being radicalized and through the idea of fake news or subjective facts, or however you want to call it. And I started realizing that this was part of a larger situation as opposed to a personal situation, which is exactly what this country doesn't talk about. Like, we talk about lone wolves. We talk about, individuals who go out and do this, who are unhinged and cause these problems, but we don't talk about the larger societal problem. And when I started looking at him as a person, I started looking at him as possibly an intelligent person who had been not just misled but manipulated. That sort of started opening the door for that, I think, larger, more important narrative.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the evidence for what you're saying is borne out by the pictures coming out of Charlottesville, and you see all these young white guys who they feel like they're the victim, they're the ones that are getting the short end of the stick. And they've been in these, like you said, they've been radicalized. Like we talk about terrorists being self-radicalized online and whatever, that it's really no different. It's, it's a kinship with a larger diaspora that, we hadn't considered before, that, maybe white people are susceptible to this too. So,
well, it's the exact same thing. And it's weird to say it, but it's the exact same thing that we see with ISIS, right? Like we see groups of people who have in the past had more power than they have now. Their control and their power is under fire and being attacked by progress. And as economics meet with sociology, psychology takes over, and so they can be radicalized, and their frustration and their aggravation can be acted upon, and the next thing you know, you have radicalized murderers. And I actually think that, and again, we're talking about masculinity too, right? There's like a lot of different parts to this, and so what we see is a group of people who now live in this subjective world, who are ripe to be manipulated and ripe to be fed this trash and this drivel, and they will and have acted, and I think that that's a much larger issue than we give it credit for.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, everybody wants to talk about identity politics, but this is identity politics right here. This is a very specific kind that I guess I didn't have the imagination before now, but now it's kind of in all of our faces. So, but yeah, one of the surprises in your book, at least to me, was how hard you came down on Bernie Sanders and his supporters. In fact, the first time you talk about him in the book, you say everybody knew Bernie Sanders wouldn't be president. You later describe him and his supporters as angry, compare them to Trump supporters in some way. What was your overall impression of his campaign? Why could not he have been president? I'm sympathetic to the argument that he would have beat Trump, honestly, because, I feel like the right through, and you talk about, Fox News and all these places, Rush Limbaugh, I feel like they've kind of, it's baked into the cake that they hate the Clintons, and Hillary especially. So that's kind of a special case, and I don't think they would have had that cudgel to beat him with. And granted, he's a socialist, he's, this and that, they could have smeared him with. But, what do you think of that argument?
Well, I've spent a lot of time reassessing the election in terms of what ifs and what could happen here and what could happen there. I think there is a very real possibility that Bernie Sanders could have beat Donald Trump. I think there's a very real possibility Hillary Clinton could have beat Donald Trump. I think it's all about, the moves that are made. But when I wrote that he wasn't going to be president, I think I was writing that from the point of view of a large part of what led to Hillary Clinton's nomination was, they always say this thing about name recognition, right? Her name recognition was so much higher than his. But what we're actually talking about is inevitability. And, since we moved in the 1970s away from smoke-filled rooms into, primary systems, we now have basically the illusion that these are free and open elections, but they're not exactly, right? The heavy thumb of the party is always on the scale,
right.
And this was always Hillary Clinton's nomination to lose, and she was going to win that nomination basically with the help of the DNC for a very, very long time. And what Bernie Sanders did was actually a pretty incredible campaign for most of it. By the time he won Michigan, I would say that is like one of the more successful upstart campaigns that we've seen in American political history.
Yeah.
As far as his supporters, I actually think, and this is one thing that I had to struggle with a lot, because I actually admired Bernie Sanders quite a bit, and I actually don't necessarily hold against him what some of his supporters became, because as I was writing in the book, a lot of these people weren't necessarily Democrats or liberals. A lot of the people who came to his campaign and sort of gave their heft and their weight to it were what we would call anarchists or revolutionaries, right? Like there was a large group of people who came to support him because they wanted to burn the system down, and they'd been frustrated for a very long time. And I think that's where we saw a lot of this, and I think that's where we see a lot of Antifa people now. We have a lot of young people who are very angry about what America has become, and I think Bernie Sanders for a while was their avatar. So what we saw outside of the Democratic National Convention, which is really where I saw it boil over, was during the riots. I think a lot of those people weren't necessarily inspired by him to act in that way, but they found an outlet for him. So I admired him a lot. I actually thought his campaign was pretty incredible, and I think I wrote in the book at one point that I felt like his campaign was the closest thing we had to an heir to Obama's campaign, particularly in its rhetoric and how it presented itself. But in terms of his supporters, I think that they were a group of people who needed someone to voice their anger, and I think he was very capable of that at times.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, one concept that I've actually heard of before, but I was reminded by in your book, is the concept of attribution bias. I think it explains a lot about our current politics. Could you first describe what that is and how it figured into the 2016 campaign? Because I think it really is kind of the skeleton key for a lot of this here.
Sure. There is, and this is a branch off of cognitive theory, right? This is all about talking about how we think about thinking and how we think about processing information. And so one of the big underlying parts about this book is cognitive dissonance is this idea that when humans run across information, they have a unconscious decision that their brain makes. And the decision is, do I believe this information? And there's a lot of mechanics that go into it. At first, if that information runs contrary to what you already believe, most of the time you're not going to believe it, because it's so much easier to not believe something than it is to completely restructure your entire belief system. What goes along with that is when we meet people who disagree with us, particularly if we don't know them, if they are anonymous to us, if they are strangers, that system has like a secondary thing going for it. And that secondary thing is we believe when somebody disagrees with us, why would they disagree with us? We don't want to give them the benefit of the doubt and think that they have like good intentions. So what we do is we automatically believe that they are evil. We believe that they have this really bad reason for doing this. And so, for instance, when we talk about when we talk about what the right thinks of liberals, there's no way that liberals liberals are progressive because they want to help people. They're progressive because they're lazy, or they want to bring the system down, or they're anarchists and revolutionaries, and deep down, like Alex Jones now goes on the radio once a day and talks about how liberals are demons, and how it's a vilification of opposition, and we've seen these echo chambers really ratchet that cognitive theory up, and it's become one of the biggest problems I think we have.
Oh yeah, absolutely, and I only bring it up because I feel it in myself sometimes, because I wake up and I read the news and I'm like, these Republicans just wake up every morning and think, how can I make the country worse? Like, of course they don't think that, but it feels that way to me. Like, it's like, how can I get up today and work as hard as I can to move the clock backwards and just take away every gain we've made since the Great Depression? It's like, let's just of course that's not how they're thinking of it on their side. They're thinking they're working just as nobly as I think I'm working, so it's just a matter of perspective.
Well, and then there's a different layer of that, and so what I just described for anyone listening was basically the 101 version of this, and we're way past that. We're to postgraduate theory level of this. So what you just said about Republicans is completely true. They are trying to do they think they're doing the best for the country. So let's talk about welfare, right? When they want to go after people who are supposedly welfare cheats, or they're abusing the system or whatever, their attribution is basically they think that these people are immoral and that they're out to game the system. And so because they have that theory, their theory is then, well, they're wrong, we're right, and we're protecting people. So then actually their motives may be what you would call quote unquote good, but they're actually pretty unethical, and they're actually pretty some people would call evil and mean. So what you actually get when you get a few shades of this, and this is actually another huge problem in this country, is we're so far down the road and the knot is so tight that we've gotten to the point where maybe their intentions are good, but it doesn't matter if the intentions are good because it's so warped at this point.
Yeah, absolutely. So you went to the Republican and the Democratic conventions, which you kind of just described the people that showed up, because then you say later that the Green Party convention was the first place where you actually had press credentials, and that chapter was actually really interesting to me with the Green Party convention. First of all, the fact that Julian Assange was the kind of invited teleconferenced in guest of honor. That got me thinking about how, Sean Hannity and, all these super right-wing people are now so on board with, Julian Assange. I don't remember hearing them say much about this when Bradley Manning was, doing what he was doing, or Chelsea Manning back then. Right. So, now they've suddenly flipped when it turns to their side. But, and it kind of further made me think of that photo I'm sure you've seen of that dinner in Moscow honoring RT, where you see Putin next to Jill Stein, next to Michael Flynn, and it's like that horseshoe theory where it's like the left and the right, when you get to a certain fringe, it's like there's that crossover. What did you see at the Green Party convention? And I just thought that whole scenario was fascinating.
Yeah, so the Green Party convention was kind of a disaster in every possible way. I mean, it was strange, and I was really glad that I was able to go to, and just chronologically, I was able to go to the Democratic National Convention for the Green Party convention, because at the Democratic convention was where you saw a lot of people who identified themselves as Green Party, but were going to cross over and vote for Bernie Sanders, which was, a chunk of his support. And the Green Party is traditionally a very, very liberal party. And so I got to the Green Party convention, and a lot of them were still carrying Bernie Sanders, signs, and Jill Stein was still talking about Bernie Sanders. And so you had a lot of liberals, far less liberals, who were at this thing, but there was actually a strange amount of anger that looked a lot like things at the heart of the Donald Trump campaign. I saw racism there. I saw chants of lock her up. And what I slowly came to realize was that it's not necessarily the horseshoe theory, which I think is important in starting to understand the situation. But what we actually have in this country, I'm starting to find out, is we basically have two parties. We have one party that believes that American government is flawed, that needs, can be worked on. And we have another group of people that just want to tear it down to the studs.
Mm-hmm.
And, in each of those, there is the left and the right.
Mm-hmm.
In the party that believes this thing needs to be torn down, on the right you have people who support Donald Trump, and on the left you have people like the Green Party. And everybody else in America is basically on the other side, just trying to survive in a shared society. And everybody else is sort of like trying to destroy that shared society.
Mm-hmm.
And it was a really eye-opening, weird day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I really like the one scene you had of the kind of impromptu press gaggle, quote unquote, with the very sympathetic Green Party bloggers tossing the softballs at Jill Stein. That was pretty evocative of, it's like, we don't really need to ask this person too many hard questions, because it's not like this person really is going to be president. You kind of had that view of, it's like, everybody kind of knew the score. You know what I mean? It
was incredible.
Yeah.
And for those, anybody who's interested, and again, this is a good way to spend an afternoon. Anyone who's interested should try and track down interviews with Jill Stein. Go find anything you can find where she's doing a press conference or a sit-down interview. She's not a serious person. I mean, she's obviously intelligent because, she's earned degrees or, whatever, but she's not up to snuff when it comes to politics. My God, the fact that she was a party's nominee for president should terrify people. And so when we had this press conference, which was, supposed to be the crowning moment, she had just been nominated by the Green Party. She was a national nominee for president. She went into this press conference, which was shoddy and terrible. And you have a bunch of very, very young Green Party bloggers helping her answer fundamental questions that are softballs, right? The easiest questions imaginable. And you have these bloggers coaching her through it and giving her thumbs up and really letting her know that they had her support. And she still couldn't handle it. I mean, I think she got one halfway decent question from Elliot Nelson, a reporter, and she just couldn't do it. She could not handle it. And these bloggers basically went up to her afterwards and were like, "I'm sorry that went like that, and I think you did great." And it was just the most flummoxing thing I'd seen in forever. The fact that this person was going to be running for president.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, maybe next time you should go to the Libertarian one. I'm sure that would be a fun experience as well. So.
I read enough articles to know that thing sounded like more of a party.
Yeah, I read that Dave Weigel from the Washington Post account, and that was a pretty interesting situation.
Yeah, if I can make that happen in 2020, I'm definitely going to.
Absolutely. So in the chapter where you talk about alternative media, you mentioned that you watched every single episode of Glenn Beck's show between 2009 and 2011. Why, in the name of everything that's holy, would you do that to yourself?
Well, first of all, just hearing you say that out loud is very shameful. That's a true fact, and I wrote it in my book, and just hearing it out loud made me shudder a little bit. So at the time, I was working as an adjunct professor at Ball State University, and this was around the time where the economy was still a total disaster, and we had no idea exactly where the country was going. And I caught the first episode of it, and I was just like, this is very dangerous, right? And this is actually terrifying. And I have an old idiom, and that is, if you're at a bar and a dangerous, crazy person comes into the bar, you don't turn your back on them, right? You keep at least one eye on them. And I'm the exact same way with Alex Jones. Every week I listen to at least one episode of Alex Jones just to keep up with the level of absurdity and what the narrative is. And in all actuality, when you when you watch this stuff, I think that we forget that there are people out there who buy it and that there are people out there who are influenced by it. And you actually get a pretty good sense of where the narrative and mood and it of the country is going. And people forget it, but Glenn Beck was incredibly powerful politically for a while. And, I just had this just waking anxiety terror that he was going to continue gaining power, but it wasn't his power to hold. I mean, eventually this turned into, what we called the Tea Party and eventually Trumpism. And, I think it was more the anxiety of who he was and what he represented is why I had to watch that.
Right. Absolutely. Well, you're made of stronger stuff than I am, because I get through 5 minutes of Rush Limbaugh and I'm like, I'm screaming at the radio right now, and I need to find a funk station or something to make this all go away. But you're right. This is the entire media diet of certain people, not certain people, a lot of people, people that we're related to. I really thought one of the more powerful sections of your book was where you kind of mention your family, and the kind of great rift that has kind of sprung up in the last, since, let's be real, since Obama was elected, maybe even before then, the people getting their entire worldview from Fox News and I have experienced it myself. Whole branches of my family are completely alien to me. We don't even speak the same language, we don't even talk about the same things or use the same words. I feel like Fox News, and you mentioned Glenn Beck and Alex Jones, I feel like these people have split the country into, these non-overlapping, kingdoms, and it's just, I don't even know how to relate,
Yeah, I think we're seeing, and the more that I look at it, and I wish that I had something better to say about this. I wish I had better news, but it really is beginning to feel like to me that we're seeing a shift in how society works. In the past, it was the family that held society together, right? It was your immediate bond. No matter what happened, no matter if you agreed or disagreed, you always went back to your family. And you could disagree about politics, unless you were ostracized from your family and thrown out. But now I don't think we're having that continue. I think we're seeing, especially with the internet, we're seeing groups of like-minded people coalesce around each other in new, chosen, artificial families. And, this is part of the echo chamber phenomenon, but it's also one of the reasons why we can be related to people, but see our bonds sort of, be strained, is because we don't have to go to each other for verification anymore. We don't really argue with each other anymore. What we do is we start to feel like our family isn't who is closest to us, right? It's the people around us. It's our friends. It's our colleagues. It's the people who basically agree with us, and we can go and talk to them about our opinions. And so it's actually making the bond of family not just disintegrate to a certain extent, but it's actually making us all entrenched more and more in our own opinions.
Yeah, and I think this is kind of the opposite of what the people who, came up with the internet or promoted it in the early stages kind of imagined, where it's like, oh, the whole world coming together. It's like, not really. It's just you basically find people with your little idiosyncratic preferences, and you all just encamp together, and you don't let anyone else in your fort, and it's not like you're connecting with the whole world. You're just connecting with a very small subset of the world that you close yourself off from everything else.
Well, yeah, and I think that what you just said, I think, hits on an important part of this, which is, I think the people who created, Facebook and Twitter and social media and even the internet, I think that a lot of them had a very utopian view of the world. They thought that they were going to usher in paradise and a new era of peace with these tools, right? But in fact, I think that how we've seen it unfurl and progress, nobody could have known, right? It's very much, setting loose on the world, an invention and having no clue of what it would eventually become. And I still don't think that we understand the fundamental effects of what we've let loose. I don't think that we understand not only how it's changing our relationships, but how it's changing us personally. And so we're trying to catch up. I mean, the fact that you had the news asking about echo chambers assisted by the internet, like when the fact that came up in 2016, I mean, this stuff has been going on since at least the early 2000s. And the fact that we're just now catching up, I think, is one of the more sort of worrying things, that we're this far behind the curve.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Kind of an interesting parallel in my own life with reading your book. You talked about how people close themselves off, especially on social media, Facebook, things like that. I had one of my friends after the, latest unpleasantness, just one of many in St. Louis with the, cop shooting the black person and getting away with it. This person that I know posted Black Lives Matter on Facebook, something I've said myself and had, people from my own family block me for saying. And this person did that, and the first comment was Pitbull Lives Matter. And then they got into this argument and ended with the person unfriending them on Facebook. And, everyone was congratulating them for standing up to this person. And I was like, okay, that's great. You may be the last person they're Facebook friends with who would say Black Lives Matter out loud. What if you're the last connection to that way of thinking, and they're going to go the rest of their whatever life they have, and they're not going to hear a divergent opinion like that to make them, rethink what they're thinking? And it's like, yeah, we can all pat ourselves on the back that we took this stand or whatever, but like, where does that get us? Where are we going with this?
Well, and then so there's so many different parts to that too, right? It's how do we expect to sort of have that battle? Like who's supposed to do that, right? And who's putting themselves, basically in the sights of someone to have not just unpleasant, but at times abusive conversations. Like, is that everyone's responsibility? Is that the relative's responsibility?
Yeah.
And it's such a large problem and a complicated problem that I don't even know where you start on that. I don't even know. I put in the book that, this is obviously a way that our realities get sealed off from each other, but I hesitated from giving a solution because I don't know even how to start formulating a solution. It's a problem that is so giant that I don't even know where you start untangling it.
Yeah, and I'm not even sitting on some pious hill saying this. I've done the same thing. I've unfriended people for things I perceived as being racist or small-minded or bigoted in some way. I'm not above that. I don't think it's my responsibility to put up with abuse just so I can educate people that I don't have the responsibility, I don't think, to educate. I figured this out somehow. You figure it out. Like, am I supposed to teach everybody in the world how to sing in harmony? Like, is that really my job? I don't know. Like, I'm not being paid well enough for that.
Well, for me, I made the decision a while back that I was going to do that, right? Like I made the decision a long time ago with my family. My family, I love them very much, but they are very ignorant in a lot of different ways, and in pretty much every way you can imagine. They can be at times a very, very stereotypical working class white family. And I made a decision a long time ago. I was either going to go away from them and just really not have anything to do with them, or I was going to be the voice of reason with them. And I chose the latter. And I can tell you that there have been inroads at times, but there's been a lot of frustration. And that's what I've chosen to do. But I also can't sit here and tell people that they need to do it. And so, again, that's the crux of the problem is what do you do after that?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Another interesting anecdote you had from the book that kind of relates to current events, you talked about Matt Drudge calling Hurricane Matthew fake news, basically, while your house is getting pummeled by a hurricane, and then that made me think of this latest, Irma thing with, Rush Limbaugh and Ann Coulter, saying it's fake news, and then them evacuating. You know what I mean? Like, how do we go forward when the weather's up for grabs? It's like it's raining. Okay, like there's not. Do you feel the wetness hitting your face? Like, how much more real can it be? So.
Well, and I actually think the Rush Limbaugh thing, and this is also with Matt Drudge. I am a giant proponent of freedom of speech. I'm a giant proponent of my freedom extends from the tip of my nose to the tip of yours. But isn't that the modern equivalent of yelling fire in a crowded theater? I mean, like, like when you really think about it, you have people who are obviously pushing some sort of like political agenda with this. And I have to assume that Matt Drudge and Rush Limbaugh both not just put people in harm's way, but I have to assume that cause damage. I mean, you have to believe that. And so my problem is, if you really believe that, like if you really, believe that these storms are being hyped up by the media or whatever, if you really believe that and so you're speaking your mind about it, that's one thing. But when you're doing it and it is so obvious to push an agenda or for political profit, I think then we get into like a different level of conversation, right? Then all of a sudden we're talking about endangering people. And I think that you have a group of people in Drudge, Limbaugh, Alex Jones, the people at Breitbart, like this, what you would call the far right. These are a group of people who have not only created echo chambers, but they didn't create echo chambers because necessarily they believed what they were saying. They've done it as a matter of political manipulation. And I think that now the fact that we have this subjective reality, I think we were always going to get here. I think the progress of humanity is to eventually get to a point of subjective reality. I mean, everything that we have, every development, every invention has always been getting us to this point. But we have a group of people who are manipulating that in the same way that you would have slumlords in urban cities. When people came there, they would build them tenements that kept them, in terrible conditions and endangered their lives. Or, with industrialization, you had business owners who would create factories and then lock the doors and let people die in fire. You now have a group of people who are using this progress, but they're doing it in such a way to manipulate people that it's not just unethical, but I actually think it's quite dangerous. Right. And I think that's actually, again, it's like, at the turn of the century, we had like children working in factories. We didn't realize at the time like how wrong that was, and I think we still haven't realized how wrong it is for this group of people to be doing this. And I think later on in history, if we are so lucky to not have a nuclear war,
you're assuming a lot there.
I am, and every time now that I talk about in the future we'll do this, it's just like, oh my God, tone it down. But I think in the future we're going to look back, and this is going to be the same thing as like yellow journalism, and how you have the Hearst family leading us into the Spanish-American War. Like, this is going to be a time period that we look back on, and we see an obvious trend that should have been obvious to us at the time.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Well, I'm glad that you're talking about Alex Jones, because that kind of fits perfectly into what he had to say when he was going through his child custody battle, and they were talking about, he says all these things on InfoWars, and his response was, I'm just an entertainer, just having fun up here. I don't know, I don't really believe any of this. So it's like when the rubber really meets the road, when you're in court fighting for your kids and it's really important to you, all of a sudden, this is all just smoke and mirrors, folks. It's all just fun and games. And it's like, people believe you, dude. People believe everything that comes out of your mouth, and they think that you're telling the truth. Also, I love how he talks about the New World Order and the Illuminati, and he somehow doesn't think Donald Trump would be involved in that if it existed. Give me a break, dude. You broke into Bohemian Grove and you don't think he would be there? Come on, dude. Like, where is your antenna right now?
Well, first of all, I really enjoy that you just brought up Bohemian Grove.
I used to live in Northern California, and I actually went to Bohemian Grove, but go on.
Well, I just love that, this is something that I think about, like, in the genre of things that I think about constantly that nobody in my life thinks about. Anyway, so Alex Jones, I actually think, and if you don't mind, I like to get deep in the weeds on stuff like this.
Oh, go ahead, man. I've been down that rabbit hole, so give it to me.
So Alex Jones in his custody case, I think when he came out and said, I'm just a performer or whatever, I think that is like a really, really interesting place to dive into what I would call identity in the 21st century. And here's the case. I think that Alex Jones deep down is basically a conglomerate of 3 or 4 different people. And I think everybody is, quite frankly. I think that we've actually moved to a point in human existence where we are sort of a combination of different avatars. We have what is it, code switching, right? Mm-hmm. When I'm talking to you as this figure. Mm-hmm. I'm talking to you as the person who wrote that book. I'm not talking to you as the guy who was drinking his coffee just a little bit ago. Right. Like you have to switch in these different things. I'm also a teacher, which when I go in front of a classroom, I am a character, and I have to be because the person who is actually me could not handle being in front of a classroom, mm-hmm. speaking about intellectual engagement for hours at a time. So I actually think that Alex Jones, when he said that, I think he was both being honest and also lying. I think that he has become so entrenched in the character of Alex Jones that he probably doesn't even know the difference between the person who started out doing this and the person he's become. Mm-hmm. And that is so deep and esoteric, but also incredibly important when we're talking about modern America, which is where you have 300 million people who basically inhabit 3 or 4 different lives at any given time. You have your professional life, your personal life, your online life, your internal life, and you have all of these things happening all at once. So things don't make sense anymore. And when we're actually looking at how politics and society moves forward, we're actually looking at people who are very confused about who they are and what they're advocating and their own personal interest in things. And so that's how you end up with a group of people who support Donald Trump, and they don't support rich people. They might be, evangelist, right? Mm-hmm. Like they might be evangelical, and yet they're looking at a guy who's been married, I think, 3 times, who has flaunted public affairs, who is very vulgar and sexual and all these different things. You have a group of people who support him even though he runs counter to everything they believe and everything about their own identity, but he is now the most entrenched thing in their identity, mm-hmm. right? And so you have a group of people who now basically say, I'm a Trump person, which means that they are of a certain political, sociological perspective, even though they don't believe in Donald Trump. Mm-hmm. And yet every day they have this cognitive dissonance of he's not building the wall. Well, he will build the wall. He's just lying to them and them and them. So we fundamentally live in like a dishonest society where no one even really realizes how dishonest they're actually being, but they have to continue to entrench themselves in that dishonesty. And I think Alex Jones is like a really good figure to try and understand that through, because he's so bombastic and ridiculous.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, I'm surprised you haven't bought any male vitality supplements. We're listening to so much Alex Jones.
Bone Brew. Have you heard about Bone Brew?
Mm-mm.
Okay, so again, I'm so sorry to go on a tangent, but nobody else knows about this. Okay, so of all of his products Alex Jones sells, which is, he'll get on and he'll talk about, how Donald Trump is a real man, and then the next thing you know, he's selling like male vitality. And then
nootropics. We got the nootropics, folks. Big information.
Nootropics. Yeah, so there's this thing called Bone Brew, which is actually just sort of some formula that is a bunch of like chicken parts, that have just been boiled down, and he's like, this is what the cavemen ate, and what we need to do is we need to get back to that Neanderthal life. And you're like, that is so off the rails, like unhinged. But yet, this is like what these people are doing. They're drinking bone brew. They're eating things called caveman, and like you said, nootropics, and their colloidal silver stuff. And so they have all these trinkets that are absurd, but they're putting a lot of their time and energy into it. It's crazy.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, switching gears a little bit, you were talking about some recommendations for the Democratic Party, which are interesting, and I thought that you made some good points about, NAFTA kind of being the thing you saw, at least in your own kind of working class background, that split people off from what traditionally was the Democratic base, is the unions or the working class, whatever. I was wondering if you had read, did you read the Ta-Nehisi Coates piece, The First White President?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I did.
Because I read that right after I read your book, and it kind of like mixed all up in my head, and I thought it was an interesting kind of counterpoint there, because you were kind of saying the thing that he was kind of arguing against was that, this is about economics, and we've left these people behind, and we should, if you're going to attack Trump, you should focus on him as being out of touch with their actual everyday economic interests, and he's a bad businessman, and he's put all these chinks in his armor. But obviously his point more was that whiteness was the main and unifying factor of his thing, and this talk about economic anxiety or the working class, you're really only talking about the white working class, and blacks of the black working class is expected to do bad, and that's not something that we don't expect from our society. But when we have an opioid epidemic, all of a sudden is treated with kid gloves and treatment, and we want to change all these laws. But when there's a crack epidemic, lock them up, mandatory minimums, record prison population. So I was just wondering how you thought about that kind of divide, or what kind of path the Democratic Party or liberals in general should take to recapture that, because it does seem like there's a separation there.
Well, yeah, and so I would actually say that I both agree and disagree, and I thought that was a very good argument on in terms of what he was making.
Right, exactly.
I would actually say that when we're talking about the Democratic Party, and we're talking about what I guess you could summarize it into what we're talking about with a populist approach moving forward. I think we're talking about different things, and I think the crux of it is that we can have identity politics and we can have populism. And the reason is this. The reason is that the largest manipulation of the American public, particularly the working class white Americans, has been it's been a sleight of hand, right? And it's been a lie. So for the longest time, people have been told basically that economics has to be, at its heart, a tribalist issue, right? So working class white Americans have been satiated for a long time by being told, well, you're not doing well, but at least you have social and political power over these groups of people.
Right, exactly.
Right? You're not doing great, but these other people, they're doing worse, and you're farther up on the social and political spectrum than them. What the Democratic Party needs to do, and this is such an incredibly hard, nuanced thing, and quite frankly, this is one of those things that in 2016, it would be really hard to do. But I think it's the only way moving forward, and it's the only way that we get the car out of the ditch, which is to let people know how this game has been played, right? And the fact is, I was writing about this not too long ago. You have a lot of like working class white people right now who are fighting for, they're mad that their factories are gone and that their mining jobs are gone. And I say that as a person whose family are miners and factory workers. They're wanting these old jobs back, but fundamentally, they never were good jobs.
Right.
They were terrible jobs.
Exactly.
They used them. They chewed them up and spit them out. Mine workers have terrible standards of living. I mean, I have a younger brother who is a mine worker, and it's aged him. I mean, you make decent money, but you make decent money because you're sacrificing your state of life.
Right.
And the thing that needs to be done, and this is a very large, very complicated thing, is to draw the bridge between economic and social well-being. And the whole idea of this is, for as long as we're told that we are different and that we are fundamentally opposed to one another, the more that we can be kept apart from each other in terms of like financial solidarity. And economically, we are a lot stronger when we are a united front of a working and middle class taking on the people who are in charge of production, right? But for the longest time, these wedge issues have kept us apart. But we can take on these social issues when we realize that by empowering other people and by making the system more fair, it's more fair for everybody. The more that we take care of these wedge issues, the more that it means that no longer are we fighting against one another. We're actually all in agreement that we should all be better off. And if we're all better off, we all do better. And I think that is a very, very large issue that would be a whole lot better if we didn't have a political system where parties are like, well, we can talk about this, but not that. And for the midterms, we should be taking this on versus that. And I think it's fundamentally a problem of imagination. It is a system where we forget what we're actually doing. We're so deep in the weeds on the symbology of it and the metaphor of it and what we can actually be. Like, Democrats have gotten so mixed up over whether or not they should be populist or going after identity politics, when I think that they've become blind to the fact that those things are inextricably linked. And they should be doing all of it at the exact same time, but they need better messengers and they need a better message.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah. And then kind of thinking about it here in Indiana, you mentioned in the book they went for Obama in 2008, and then they, of course, went for Trump in 2016. And I imagine a lot of those people still live here. They're still alive. They're still voters. They could be swayed one way or another. But then, I look at something like the carrier deal in Indianapolis where, Trump made this big announcement, we're saving the jobs, and then Mike Pence made sure that the state picked up the tab and all this stuff. But the jobs are still going away. Then we find out later. But, I think the people directly connected to that, the families may be angry about being duped. But I have this, funny feeling that if you ran the election again today, I don't think the result would be different. I think Trump would probably still win Indiana. So
I think he absolutely would. Yeah. And the carrier thing was infuriating, and it was infuriating for different reasons. Not just the fact that it was so hypocritical and such a lie. Like, those jobs were still going to leave,
right.
But. Okay, so for instance, if I looked at it from the point of view, if I was still living in Indiana with my family, who, my stepfather still works for a factory right now, and that factory is in constant trouble, right? If I were to look at that from that perspective, in past years, I would look at that and be like, why that factory, right? Like, why would they move heaven and earth for that factory? And then I would be like, oh, this is obviously a political ploy. This is obviously political posturing. So that has changed. Now it's just these symbolic victories that are political spin as they have always been, but it's by a person who says, well, political spin is political spin. I'll tell it to you the way it is. And so it's actually just a secondary level of lying, a secondary level of manipulation. And so what actually happens is nobody comes out and says, why are you doing it for that factory? You're obviously lying and doing this as a political motive. Like, that's not what people were doing. And I think people understood it economically, but it's not like the Democrats came out and did that. It's not like the opposition came out and did that. And so it's a very, very thin lie that just wasn't disputed. It wasn't taken out. and I think it just simply made the case like even harder to litigate.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I could talk about your book and ideas in it all day, but what is the next book that you're working on about?
So right now, I'm working on a book about my experiences growing up in a patriarchal family. Mm-hmm. So I'm basically writing about toxic masculinity, how it gave us Trump, how it has basically curbed social progress and created a lot of problems. So it's about abuse, socialization of masculinity, and basically how toxic masculinity not just hurts women in society, but it also hurts men too. Mm-hmm. And how this is another one of those things where we've lost our imagination and our ability to think outside of our very narrow boxes, and how if we can simply take care of that, I actually think that by promoting feminism and equality, I actually think it'd be good for men as well. Mm-hmm. And I think that that's an argument that hasn't necessarily been out there.
Right. It's kind of like how people say the biggest victim of white supremacy is actually white people. So
that's exactly right.
Yeah.
No, and it's the funniest thing. Well, it's not funny, obviously, but you have all these people who are now carrying the Confederate flag as like a symbol of opposition to America, right? And yeah, like this is like one of the most racist symbols and offensive symbols that we have. But you also have a bunch of like working class white people who have adopted it. Mm-hmm. They were not going to be doing very well under the Confederacy either, right? This would have been another federal system that would have kept up economic inequality and would have served the well-off and the wealthy. And so what you actually have is you have a group of people who have a false choice. Like, I'm going to hold up this patriarchal system even though it means that I am hurting and I never get to talk about who I am and I never actually get what I need. And on top of that, I want back a job that breaks my back and, I lose limbs over and I die an early death. And so because we have that false dichotomy, like we actually have a bunch of people who are working very hard to sort of build their own jail cell.
Yeah. Do you think there's anything like Midwestern or puritanical in that, just coming from Indiana? Because I do feel like there is a certain there's a certain pride people have here that it's like, I'm going to work myself to death, and it's like, yay. Yeah. It's like, what?
Yes, I absolutely do, and that is a large chunk of what I'm writing about, because there was a point in time, and this all has to do with advertising. This has to do with generational shifts. We reached a certain point where social and economic mobility was sort of stalled, and so you have a lot of Americans who weren't able to have better lives than the people who came before them, and in the past, it used to be a man was defined by how he was able to sort of like progress. If he was able to make himself a quote unquote self-made man, even though that was never like a real thing. So at some point it became obvious that social mobility was stalled. And so it became a thing where masculinity wasn't about pulling yourself up and by your bootstraps. It was about working yourself to death. Like you weren't able to pull yourself up, but you showed everyone that you were willing to die trying. And so you have a group of people who their labor became their only source of identity and pride. And when that labor went away, it was filled with consumerism and also by political manipulation, which I think we're seeing a lot of right now.
Yep. So we're getting near the hour mark. Actually, we're over it. But thank you so much for coming back on again. And is there anything else I didn't ask you about that you want to get in there before we go?
No, I mean, if you want to do an hour on bone brew sometime, just let me know.
Maybe I'll do a taste test or something.
I think that's the podcast I've been waiting to do. Just an hour talking about Alex Jones and bone brew.
We'll have to see if we can get some kind of press sample kit, because I don't know if I want to actually pay for that. But anyway, thanks again so much. Everyone should go pick up his book. I think, honestly, after reading that, I'm like, this is going to be looked at one of those primary source documents to figure out just what happened here. Like, we're going to look back at this. This is like on the ground. You're going to get a lot of, from the street level view of like how it was at these places we only saw on TV. So I think it's a very worthwhile read. So,
thank you so much, Rob. That means a lot.
Yeah, absolutely. And thanks again for coming on, and I'll talk to you again soon.
All right, talk to you soon, Rob.
Later.
Bye.
If you enjoy this podcast, there are several ways to support it. I have a Patreon account, which can be found at www.patreon.com/Rob Burgess Show Patreon. I hope you'll consider supporting in any amount. Also, please make sure to comment, follow, like, subscribe, share, rate, and review the podcast everywhere it's available, which includes iTunes, YouTube, SoundCloud, Stitcher, Google Play Music, Facebook, Twitter, Internet Archive, TuneIn, and RSS. It really helps. The official website for the podcast is www.therobburgesshow.com. You can find out more about me by visiting my website, www.thisburgess.com. Until next time.